Hello everyone and welcome back to PC Retro Tech. In the previous video we were looking at this Socket 3 motherboard based on the SIS 85C496 chipset in our continuing series on PCI Socket 3 motherboards. But unfortunately, no matter what I tried, I wasn't able to get this board to power up. I was just getting a blank screen, and I subsequently added a speaker. I wasn't even getting any beeps to give me a hint as to what was wrong. Now, the board was getting good voltages to the CPU and it's in optically perfect condition, so it really should work. And I even went to the trouble of partially recapping the board, replacing all the capacitors around the CPU here. But after the video was uploaded, a number of viewers had some really good suggestions of things that I could try to get this board to power up. But one particular suggestion really caught my eye, and I knew immediately when I saw it that this had to be part of the problem. So let's rejoin the video this week where I try out that suggestion and see if I can get this board to go. Well, I just packed this board away, and a viewer on the channel has made an interesting comment. According to them, the motherboard manual for this board is incorrect. So this set of 3 jumpers here next to the voltage regulator where the red jumper is supposed to be the front side bus setting, and you can see in the manual that the top setting 1, 2 is supposed to be 33 MHz and the middle position is supposed to be 40. Now, I'd actually tried 33 and 40 MHz before and I just didn't get the board to go, but according to this viewer and also according to a Vogon's forum post which I found which said the same thing, the motherboard manual is labelled incorrectly, so there is a 1 on the board and it's supposed to be at the top, but apparently this jumper block here is upside down and it's actually supposed to be on pins 5 and 6 here down the bottom. So I'm going to try that out and see if the board will go. It really totally could be the problem. On the other hand, I did try the 40 MHz setting and that wouldn't be changed if the jumper block was upside down. But it's worth a try, right? I've just got a minimal configuration with a video card, CPU and RAM. I've just got the Intel DX4100 in at the moment because that'll run at 33 MHz. And I've also put a coin cell battery in and the keyboard's connected. A couple of viewers thought that could be an issue. I've not had a problem with that with Socket 3 boards, but it's worth a try. I've also connected a speaker so we can hear any diagnostic tones if we get any. So here goes nothing. Let's power it up and see what happens. So the fan is spinning and yeah, nothing. Oh, that's a shame. I totally thought that would be it. So I don't know if the CPU could be a problem. We had a problem with the DX4 in another board, so maybe I should be using an AMD chip because they seem a bit more flexible. But a couple of things I want to just try out quickly. I've got the original RAM in it that came with the board at the moment. So I know this board supports Edo, so I'm going to switch out for a known good stick of Edo RAM just in case that's the problem and see if that makes a difference. Powering on again, fan spins, yeah, no change. Oh, that's really a shame. So the only other thing I can think of at the moment is there's a couple of jumpers on the board. I don't actually know what they do. They're not listed in the manual. They should be just for the PCI slot. One should be a wait state and the other one should be for running above or below 33 MHz. But it shouldn't really make any difference when you're running at 33 MHz. I've got a jumper on one of them at the moment, just randomly. I'm just going to change it around, put a jumper on the other one as well, and see if that works. It's a bit of a long shot, but it's always worth a try. So powering on again. Fan spinning. Oh my goodness, it works! I can't believe it! That's amazing! So it was that jumper. I've got to try that again. I'm going to switch it off and start it up again and see if it's reliable. That's amazing. So powering on again. And it works. Look at that. I cannot believe that. I'm going to take that jumper off and see if it stops again. Power on again. And nothing. Look at that. I can't believe it. So that jumper, which is not listed in the manual, is actually required to make the board go. And I've really just got it on around it. There's two positions there. I've just got it on one end. I don't even know what it does. And it works. Unbelievable. Well, this is great. This board apparently is a really fast board. I've heard really great things about it. So I'm really looking forward to getting the AMD 5x86 in and cranking it up. We're only going to get to 160 with the front side bus on this, but if all reports are correct, that should be enough to give us a really good score. I just have a floppy drive and a hard drive connected at the moment, and I'm just going to set those up and make sure that they're booting to DOS. And while we're at it, we'll have a look at the options in the BIOS here. So it looks like it has quite a lot of RAM options, which is great, and the usual cache options, of course. So I'll just set up the hard drive, and we'll check the floppy drive set up correctly. It is. So let's see if this will boot. So I've just got Windows 95 DOS on here at the moment, just so I can run some benchmarks. And let's see what it tells us on the next screen about this board. So it says 256K of cache, and it seems to have hung actually. Oh man, I don't have any luck with these boards. So that's probably a cache issue. Actually, usually when things hang here, that's indication the cache is not set correctly. So I'm going to fiddle around with the cache jumpers and see if that's the problem. Yeah, so I just fiddled around with the cache jumpers, and it does seem like one of them must have been set incorrectly. I'm getting a little bit further this time, so let's see what happens. Hopefully it doesn't hang on the next screen again. Yeah, so it's now going through to Windows 95 DOS, and I'm going to go into the Phil's Computer Lab DOS benchmark suite, and I'll go into the check CPU option here. So it says Intel 486DX 400 MHz, front side bus looks correct, and this is a write through mode CPU, so that's great. And I'll also run a cache check as well and see what that tells us. Now that's interesting. It says it's clocked at 65.3 MHz, which is not what the CPU reported. So I'm going to have to run a benchmark here and see what's going on there. That's a little bit strange. But anyway, you can see that the cache is working at least. So you see 10, 29, and 110 microseconds per kilobyte. And so those are the speeds of the L1, L2, and main memory. So everything's working fine there. I'm going to run a benchmark. I'll run the Quake Benchmark and see if we should get something around about 9.7, 9.9 if it's working correctly. I really don't know why it's saying 65.3 megahertz there. That's just really weird. Yeah, you can see it's running really quite slowly. We'll see in a moment whether it's actually anywhere near the performance of 100 megahertz. I don't know whether I have the jumpers set incorrectly, or maybe there's some other issue here. But anyway, the score that we're getting at the moment is 7.4. Yeah, that's way too low. So I have to do some debugging. It could be that I need the turbo switch jumpered. Perhaps that's the problem. Anyway, I'll look into this and see if I can figure out what's causing it to run slowly. To my eye, it looks like it's running faster now. I've just jumpered the turbo switch. We'll see in a moment if I'm right or not. And yeah, 10 frames per second, which is actually a really good score for Intel DX4. Bear in mind, I haven't changed any settings in the BIOS yet. So let's go ahead and do that. I think we're going to get a really good score for DX4100 here. So I'm just going to have a look and see whether there's a boot up system speed. That's weird, it's actually set to high, so I don't know why I needed to have the turbo jumpered to make it boot up at a higher speed. That's a little bit strange to me. Anyway, let's have a look at the chipset features. So obviously I'm going to disable auto, and I think this is probably the best that it can be. And maybe some of these settings are already at the maximum, probably because it's running at 100 megahertz. And maybe that also explains why this board... no, some of the RAM settings here have lower settings. So let's just knock everything back to minimum. Fastest. And I don't think we need that on. Yeah, alright, let's try this and see if we get a better Quake score. And unfortunately the RAM doesn't like that at all, so I'm going to try some other RAM chips and see whether it's just a RAM problem. At the moment it just hangs with those settings, but that's a fairly standard thing if the RAM isn't up to par. Well, I've tried every piece of Edo RAM in my collection, which is quite a lot, and unfortunately it just stops here. Interestingly enough, it's not completely hung. I can still go into the BIOS at that point, which is definitely a first for that. But presumably one of those DRAM settings is incorrect. So my guess is it's going to be the 0 wait state. So I'll set that to 1. At any rate, I'm going to fiddle around with these settings for a while and see if I can get it to go. Well, I fiddled around a little bit, and the only option that I really need to change here is this DRAM RAS to MA delay. It seems like that needs to be on 2, regardless of which RAM chips I use. Everything else can be maxed out here, and so I'm going to go ahead now and run a benchmark again and see whether we get a better score in Quake. Yeah, so this seems to be working now with those settings, and the score we're getting is actually 10.7. So that's a really good score for an Intel DX4. So now we can go ahead and try out the AMD 5x86 and see if we get an even better score. Well, we certainly should at 160 megahertz. I'm going to go ahead and change out the Intel DX4 here. You'll notice I'm not using any thermal paste. I probably should be today. It's actually a very hot day, but these CPUs don't seem to get very hot. So I'm just putting in the AMD 5x86 P75, which will run at 133 megahertz with the frontside bus of 33, and we'll eventually crank it up to 40. I'll need to go ahead and change all these jumpers here, so I'll get to that, and then we'll run a Quake benchmark again. Well, powering on again, and here's hoping. I've just got it at 133 megahertz at the moment, just to make sure that's working okay. And it does seem to be booting up. It even recognises it as an AM5x86 P75 at 133. Very good support here, and it looks like it's going to boot. So I'll go ahead and get a Quake benchmark underway. Well, it definitely feels faster, and it certainly seems to have made it all the way through the benchmark. Of course, this is still only 133 megahertz, but let's see whether we get a score better than 10.7. And 12.4, not bad at all. So the only thing that remains now is to crank it all the way up to 160 and see if we get an even better score. Now I should remind you at this point, of course, that the channel record, so far not the world record, but the channel record at 160 is 16.8 frames per second. We did get once at 16.9, but not on camera and not repeatable. So that's what we're aiming for, so let's see if we can do it. In theory, all I should have to do is move this jumper here from 33 to 40 megahertz, and with the internal multiplier of 4, that should give us 160. So let's power it on and see whether it will boot at this speed. So remember that all the RAM settings are maxed out except for that one. It does actually detect that it's 160, so this board really has fantastic support for this CPU, and starts booting, and it looks like it's going to boot. So let's run another benchmark. Well, it's absolutely zipping through at 160 megahertz, so I'm expecting a good score here, but it remains to be seen whether it will be better than before. 14.9, actually that's really low. So yeah, that's a bit disappointing. We've got everything pretty much maxed out, and it is running at 160, and unfortunately that is not a brilliant score. So isn't that interesting? That ran the Intel stuff pretty well, seemed to run very well at 133 megahertz, and at 160 it's just lackluster. Oh well, that's just how the cookie crumbles. So what I've heard about this board may be correct, but not in my measurements. Well, as you can see, I got slightly more out of it. It's now at 15 frames per second. I just found some additional options in the PCI options in the BIOS, and when I enable those, it just gets a little bit more out of it. What I suspect is happening in this board is that it's actually running the PCI at 33 megahertz, or maybe just half of the CPU speed, and I don't know where there's a jumper, or even if there's a jumper, to change that. So unfortunately, without being able to make the PCI run at the front side bus, we can't get the maximum out of this. So I'm going to try 50 megahertz now and see whether that makes any difference. Actually, before we move on, I did get just a little bit more out of it. It turns out that one of the two unknown jumpers, if I set it in the other setting, gives me just a slightly higher score, so presumably it's adding a wait state somewhere. Anyway, we're now at 15.1 frames per second at 160 megahertz. So now I'm going to look around and see if I can get 50 megahertz front side bus. So I probed around with a multimeter and I found the clock multiplier pin, R17, is broken out at a jumper up the far end. Basically the third pin in, I think, from that end. And so now I believe that I have a multiplier of 3 with that jumper removed. So I've just set the front side bus jumper to that third setting that we originally thought was 33 megahertz, but isn't listed in the manual. And so now look what happens when I turn the board on now. So I believe this is 50 megahertz, so 3 times 50 would be 150, and indeed that's exactly what it's displaying. So 50 megahertz frontside bus is not mentioned at all in the manual. Now the only problem is that it hangs at the same point every time when it tries to boot here. So my guess now is that we have a cache timing issue, or could be a memory timing issue, so I'll have to go back into the BIOS again and fiddle around with those settings until I figure out which one is preventing it from booting. Well, I found out something quite interesting here. So if I put the jumpers, 2 of the jumpers on this end of the frontside bus jumper block, then it still registers as 150 megahertz. But when I go into CPU check and cache check, it says 150 megahertz for this setting. But when I have just the single jumper on the other end, instead of saying 150 megahertz in those programs, it says 165. In other words, the frontside bus is at 55 megahertz. So that would be really cool if we could get this going, but unfortunately I haven't been able to get this board stable at all at 165. I've only been able to get it to work at 150 and 160, of course. Now at 150, there's only one particular set of memory and cache settings that actually worked. Even if I slowed it down, it wouldn't work, so that's really odd. But let me show you those settings. So it's a really weird mix of settings. So I have to have 313, so both of these need to be not at the minimum. That one is already at the minimum. And then this has to be 21112, and then I can have fastest here. But yeah, if I slow the settings down or speed them up from here, it just won't work at all. So that's really bizarre. Not encountered that very often, that's for sure. Anyway, I have got it stable at this setting, so 150 megahertz. So let's do a Quake benchmark and see how it looks. And unfortunately, that's the score we get at 150 megahertz. It's 14.9 FPS, which is pretty dismal. It's only just behind the 160 megahertz score, but still nowhere near the channel record. Now it could be that the cache chips are holding us back here. That's maybe why we can't get those better timings in the BIOS. And it's also possible that it's just too hot today. The voltage regulator on this thing is actually burning hot, so that could be an issue. But it could just as equally well be the particular chips in the chipset on this particular board. It could be any number of things. The main thing that's holding me back, as far as I can see, is that I don't find a way to set the PCI speed to the front side bus speed. I suspect it's actually running at a slower speed, and that of course means that the video card is not going as fast as it can. So there really isn't very much more I can do to get any more out of this board. That's basically it for this week, I think. Let me know in the comments whether you'd like to see some programming content coming up soon, or whether you want to see the other two boards that I have, the Socket 3 boards, and see if we can break the channel record with those. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this look at this particular SIS board, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And that's it for this week. We'll see you in a later video. Bye.